Hello, everybody. Before we get started, I would like to go over a few items so you know how to participate in today's event. You may have joined the presentation listening using your computer speaker system by default. If you would prefer to join over the telephone, just select phone call in the audio pane and the dial-in information will be displayed for you. We welcome your questions and you will have the opportunity to submit text questions to today's presenter by typing your questions into the questions pane of your attendee control panel. You can send your questions in at any time during the presentation and we'll collect them and address them during the Q&A session at the end of today's presentation. Today's webinar, LTBI, New Guidelines from the WHO, Getting Away from INH. It's my pleasure to introduce your speaker, Dr. Dick Menzies, and your facilitator, Annette Tryman. Dick Menzies received his medical training at McGill University, Montreal, and specialty training in internal medicine at the Medical College of Pennsylvania in Philadelphia, USA. After a 2.5-year stint in Lesotho, Africa, he received further training in respiratory medicine and a master's degree in epidemiology and biostatistics at McGill University. Dick Menzies has served as a medical director at the Montreal Chest Institute for a total of 10 years, ending in 2002. As director of the Respiratory Epidemiology Unit at McGill University for 13 years, and as director of the Respiratory Division for 9 years. Dick Menzies has a long history of involvement in tuberculosis care and research, beginning with his years in Lesotho, where tuberculosis is highly endemic. Since his return to Montreal, he has developed a tuberculosis research program of clinical and epidemiologic studies linked with a large multidisciplinary clinical service at the Montreal Chest Institute and the Public Health Unit of Montreal. He developed and led international collaborative groups in nosocomial transmission of TB, MDR TB treatment, INH resistant TB treatment, and large-scale randomized trials in 9 countries. Dr. Menzies has also been involved as a consultant to the national TB programs in the Dominican Republic, Guyana, and Ecuador. He was on sabbatical at WHO in 2014-15, where he helped develop the Global Action Framework for TB Research. He has worked with the WHO and other agencies to develop guidelines for treatment of active and latent tuberculosis. He's published over 300 peer-reviewed papers and more than 30 book chapters based on the results of his research. And our facilitator today, Annette Tryman. Annette is a senior insuring professor at the Federal University of Rio de Janeiro, based on 2 post-graduation courses, internal medicine and primary healthcare. She also has an honorific position as adjunct professor at McGill University. She is a member of the advisory board of the Brazilian National TB Program and the coordinator of the clinic section of the Brazilian TB Research Network. Having served as secretary of the union's TB section, she is since last October the program secretary. Dr. Tryman has been doing programmatic and implementation research on LTBI and rapid TB diagnosis and treatment. So we have a wealth of experience for you here today. So it's my pleasure now to hand over to you, Dick.
Thank you, Jill. Good morning or good afternoon or maybe even good evening, everyone. So I'm going to talk about new LTBI treatment guidelines from WHO. And I'm going to actually emphasize, although it's not really in the guidelines, about getting away from INH. So I don't have any commercial conflicts of interest. I do receive grants from Canadian Institutes of Health Research, as well as some small grants from World Health Organization. So very briefly today, I'm going to talk about the rationale for therapy of latent TB. And then I'm going to review the different available options, first starting with INH, benefits and harms, and then run through evidence for really three, I would say, of the most popular and what are in the WHO recommendations, three regimens: 3 to 4 months of INH and rifampin combination therapy, 3 months of INH rifapentine once weekly, and 4 months rifampin daily. And then at the end, I'm going to summarize with some evidence and network meta-analysis comparing the four main options. So first, and again, I'm sure that everybody online knows this, but just to make sure we're all on the same page, what is latent TB? So it's persons with dormant or latent tuberculosis, and really the key is that they are at risk to develop disease in the future. And that's what's obviously what we're here for. They have no signs or symptoms, they're not contagious. The only manifestation is an immune reaction to antigens of M. tuberculosis, so the PPD or quantiferon or LE-spot or T-spot test are positive. Only 10 to 20%, depending on the study, will have X-ray abnormalities. So a normal X-ray does not exclude latent TB. So when we think of therapy, we think of two sort of types, broad groups of benefits. The first is individual benefit, and the second is public health benefit. So public health benefit comes because if you prevent disease, of course, you prevent future transmission. But I would say that really the primary consideration for treatment of latent TB is individual benefit. So that if an individual won't benefit, I don't think public health benefit is really that important. So when we think of individual benefit, what we're trying to do when we decide is a person, an individual in front of us, should they be recommended to start therapy? So we think of the risks of therapy, the benefits of therapy. So the benefits of therapy, of course, the greater the risk of disease, the greater the benefits, potentially. So things like HIV, diabetes, abnormal X-ray, close contacts, household contacts, these are all groups with increased risk of disease, therefore increased benefits. On the other hand, the risks of therapy, particularly well known for INH, are older age, liver disease, alcohol use. So in the presence of these kinds of things, then the therapy risks are greater. So again, when we think of who to treat, we tend to think of the risk and of course the consequences. So the risks, I think again, many people are very familiar with the idea that somewhere between 5 and 10% of people who are healthy, a young adult with a positive test, whether it's a tuberculin skin test or an IGRA test, the lifetime risk is only 5 or 10%. So it's low. On the other hand, people who are HIV infected without any treatment for latent TB, the cumulative risk may be higher than 50%. Diabetics as well, I mean, the relative risk is low, but often diabetes, people live for many, many years, so the cumulative risk mounts up. And again, undoubtedly many people are familiar with this, the age-related risk, so very high risk of disease in very young children, which falls rapidly, so that after the age of 5, it's quite low, 5 to 10% again. But in those first few years of life, which is why there is a concentration and an emphasis on under 5 child contacts, because this is the group that can develop disease very rapidly, very serious forms of disease, and they have a high risk of doing so. So the consequences are the other thing to think about. So everyone is familiar with the consequence of mortality, and in fact, all of the older risk-benefit analyses that were done really looked at mortality only. So undiagnosed smear-positive disease, the mortality is 33% per year. With diagnosis and treatment, again, globally, the mortality of TB, death during TB treatment, still remains around 5%. And even in high-income countries like Canada, we see this kind of rate of mortality, often because diagnosis is delayed or because of comorbid conditions, sometimes because this occurs in the elderly. But what is often forgotten or has been ignored is the disability. And that's very important. It turns out that in studies from the US and from low and middle income countries, there is a substantial loss of lung function on average in people who have recovered from TB. So at the end of treatment, average 20 to 25% loss of lung function. So equivalent to a lobectomy, but take this much lung function away from a young adult who perhaps needs to work physically, can be an important disability. And of course, then their normal rate of lung function decline means they may be a respiratory cripple at the age of 50. This problem has not really been considered in risk-benefit analysis, but should be considered when you're thinking about treating. Okay, so enough of the theoretical background. Now, what are some of the recommendations? So I just kind of paraphrase this a little bit to shorten it, but essentially 6 months INH is considered the first choice by WHO in adults and children in all countries. And it's a strong recommendation based on multiple randomized trials, high quality evidence. An alternative is 3 months INH rifampin, recommended for children under 15 in high incidence countries. It's a strong recommendation based on low quality evidence, which is a bit unusual that they make a strong recommendation when the quality of evidence is low. 3HP, so this is 3 months INH rifampin, is another alternative, again recommended for adults and children now, all ages, high TB incidence countries. Again, the definition of high is or low is just the cut point is 100 per 100,000. This is a conditional recommendation with moderate quality evidence. And then the added alternatives, 9 months INH, 3 or 4 months rifampin in adults and children in low TB incidence countries. This is a strong recommendation based again on moderate to high quality evidence. So those are the basic recommendations as they stand. So now let's go through the four, as I said, the four main options. So 6 to 9 months of INH. So first of all, this is from the one of the largest studies that was done. Actually, the Union did this study in Eastern Europe in adults with abnormal X-rays that were judged to be stable, so-called inactive TB. There was a large placebo group of 7,000 people, and each of these groups that you see here comprised of about 7,000 individuals. So compared to placebo, INH for 12 months reduced the incident disease over 5 years by 93%. So very high efficacy with 12 months. But you see that when they looked at all participants, intention to treat analysis, INH for 12 months was only 75% effective and was not significantly different from INH for 6 months. And in fact, it was on that basis that the decision was made to go with INH for 6 months, kind of the best trade-off between adherence and compliance and efficacy. But you see that in terms of efficacy, there's quite a difference between INH for 12 and INH for 6. Now, Dr. George Comstock did a retrospective kind of reanalysis of data from several randomized trials conducted among the Inuit in Alaska, and found that essentially with longer durations of INH, there was the case rate fell steadily, but seemed to kind of level off after about 8 or 9 months. In fact, he estimated that if you will, the sweet spot in terms of the balance between apparent efficacy and duration was 8 or 9 months. So really on that basis, the ATS CDC in 2000 recommended INH for 9 months, which has kind of become the standard in many high-income countries. So the obvious problem with INH that everyone's very familiar with is INH hepatitis. And here you see that the incidence of hepatitis is very age-related. This is kind of a combination of a study from Arkansas nursing home residents in 65 plus, and otherwise the US Public Health Survey surveillance study back in the 1970s. So clearly a very rapid rise after the age of 35, it starts to rise, and after the age of 49 or 50, it becomes more and more important. We looked at using, again, our health administrative databases. We found that 2% of persons aged over 65 who received INH only were hospitalized for a liver complication within 6 months. And these were people who had no diagnosis of liver disease in the preceding 3 years. So again, of that 5% hepatitis, there can be very severe forms. So again, I'm not going to dwell too long on INH because I'm really, my objective, if you will, is to convince people to move on. So INH is very efficacious if it's taken for 9 months or longer. There are many randomized trials demonstrating benefit in many populations, including people living with HIV/AIDS, children, etc. But against INH, poor completion, we know that less than 50% complete 9 months of INH in many programs, and indeed even 6 months of INH in many programs. Drug-induced hepatitis is overall less common because people are able to identify the well-known risk factors and try to avoid giving INH. But it is important to note that in all studies, large-scale studies, deaths or liver deaths, in other words, liver transplantation, deaths still occur, and even in, occasionally in young people. The costs, the drug itself is cheap, but because of the risk of side effects, you need to follow people closely. And close follow-up is expensive. At minimum, you can say it's resource intensive. And of course, it's long. It's at least 6 months that you need to follow people closely. So the health system costs are important. Okay, so I'm kind of dismissing INH quickly and moving on. So 3 to 4 months of INH and rifampin. What's the evidence for that? So you'll remember that the WHO recommended it as an alternative for young children, for children under 15 in high incidence countries, but said it was low quality evidence. So I haven't been able to find a more recent systematic review. I actually looked this up last week in preparation for this talk to see if I can find something more recent. So 3 to 4 months of INH versus 6 to 12 months, 3 to 4 months of rifampin INH versus 6 to 12 months of INH alone. 5 randomized trials, 1 done in Hong Kong among men with silicosis and a positive TST, the remainder among people with HIV. And as you see, smaller, larger, a total of close to 1,000 people treated in each arm. And the difference in incidence of active TB was negligible, certainly not significant. Essentially, the efficacy of 3 to 4 months rifampin INH was the same as 6 to 12 months INH. What about serious adverse events? So I just kind of spent a few minutes trying to tell you that I consider adverse events one of the huge drawbacks of INH. So is 3 to 4 months of rifampin INH any better? And in fact, the unfortunate fact is that it's not better. Although, as you see, the studies varied a lot. So some studies it was less, and some studies it was more. But overall, in the meta-analysis, again, in 1,000 individuals in each arm, the incidence of serious adverse events, which were primarily hepatotoxic adverse events, was virtually identical with the 2 regimens. So in terms of adverse events, no advantage here. So very briefly, obviously only a few slides. So when we talk about 3 to 4 months INH and RIF, I always have a bit of a problem. Is it 3 or is it 4? Remember that in the studies, some of those studies gave INH RIF for 4 months, others for 3. But really, when you're faced with a patient, you don't kind of give it for 3 or 4. You give it for either 3 or 4. So it's quite important to recognize that in these studies, if you're being conservative and you want the maximum benefit, you probably should be giving it for 4. The other point is that in those 5 trials, the comparator was actually 6 months of INH in most studies. So it's not that as though we're talking about optimal efficacy, because in the large-scale trials, 6 months INH estimated efficacy about 70%. But the most important point is that 3 or 4 months of INH RIF is no better in terms of safety than the longer INH regimen. So the only thing that you achieve with 3 to 4 months INH is some shortening and reducing burden on health system and patients simply because of burden. But I don't think you have much other advantage. Okay, so now what about 3 months, once weekly INH rifampin? So this is a regimen of considerable interest, really globally. There's a large-scale project led by Gavin Churchard, rolling this out in a number of countries. So this is, obviously in high-income countries as well. It's being rolled out in some countries widely. So it's an important regimen, an important alternative. Okay, so rifampin, just to be clear, is a rifamycin, so it's like rifampin in terms of its action on TB, but it has the half-life is 5 times longer than rifampin, so it can be given once a week. The study that I'm going to mainly review, and although there have been others, which I'll come to in terms of a systematic review, but the largest study was done sponsored by the CDC. It was done in the US, Canada, Spain, and Brazil, adults and children and persons living with HIV, active TB adverse events and completion-worthy endpoints. And again, 3 months INH rifampin is given once a week, total of 12 doses. In this study, every dose directly observed. And again, Sterling and others compared to 9 months INH, which is estimated to have efficacy of around 90%. So a better comparator. Okay, so in terms of completion, not surprisingly, 9 INH was not completed as well as 3 HP, 69% versus 82%. Of course, 69% is pretty good. It's much better than most programs, but that is the effect of a randomized trial. Now, what's really interesting here is the rate of TB disease. So you see that in people who completed 9 months INH, only 5 developed disease for a rate of 0.2%. But the 3 HP group, in those who took all doses, only 4 developed disease for a rate of 0.1%. So in fact, the efficacy of 3 HP is certainly as good as the efficacy of 9 months INH. So 12 doses of 3 HP versus 270 doses of INH, and yet you end up with very similar efficacy. And in fact, officially 3 HP is deemed non-inferior, not worse. But again, you can see it really, those numbers look, if anything, a bit better. So this appears to be a very efficacious and effective regimen given the high completion rate. So in children, this was, again, the same study or framework of study, but published a bit later, completed and published a bit later. So again, 3 HP completion better, you note in children, due presumably to their strict parents, very good completion of 9 months INH, 81%, but still significantly better with 3 HP. Grade 3 to 4 adverse events. So these grade 3 to 4 are more serious, where you should normally be stopping the drug. A little higher with 3 HP, but not significant. And the number of TB cases, 3 with INH, 0 with 3 HP. So again, 3 HP efficacy looked good. Sorry. And then in HIV infected, again published in 2016, completion significantly better with 3-HP, adverse events about the same, and TB disease not significant, but if anything, a little higher with INH. Now, so in terms of efficacy, you really, 3-HP looks good in adults, in children, in HIV infected, in all three groups. You can say that 3-HP is not worse, non-inferior, and yet obviously very advantageous in terms of completion and feasibility, etc. But there may be a bit of a downside, which is adverse events. So this is the original publication in the New England, 2011. Drugs stopped for adverse event, 5% with 3-HP, and a bit less, but actually significantly less with 9-INH. Hepatotoxicity, clearly greater with 9H than 3-HP. Very low rate of hepatotoxicity with 3-HP, which again reflects they only got 12 doses of INH, 900 milligrams each dose, but still a very low amount of INH in total. What was different with 3-HP was this hypersensitivity, and significantly more. So this hypersensitivity was investigated further, and a subsequent publication came out in 2015. So as you see, about 3% of people got this systemic drug reaction, a so-called flu-like syndrome, of whom about a tenth, or 0.3%, 3 per thousand, got a severe reaction, and 4 were hospitalized. And again, this reaction, so that it can be serious. 4 people ended up in hospital. Nobody died, but this reaction is not well understood, and it is difficult to predict. And I was part of this randomized trial, or not as a patient, I guess I could say, but as an investigator. So actually, one of the patients I enrolled in the study actually experienced one of these severe STRs. So it can be kind of nasty looking, and therefore does require access to good supportive care. Okay, very briefly, just in case someone is curious about this, I've not yet seen this published, but it's expected to be published. But this was presented really and published in abstract form only. Ultra short regimen, 1 HP daily. So rifampin and INH given daily, but only for 1 month compared to 9 months INH. HIV infected individuals, a study sponsored by the AIDS Clinical Trials Group. Only 20% of the patients were TST positive. The remainder were not tested, but were living in countries with high TB incidence. TB rates were low and equal in both arms. Adverse event rates were relatively high, although drugs stopped only in 2% in both arms. And completion rates were very high in both arms. So this promising, of course, but I think we have to wait and see the full publication to get a bit more details, and possibly other studies, particularly in non-HIV infected individuals, before we'd be able to say much about this regimen. But it is kind of in the shadows at the moment. Okay, so one question is whether this 3-HP can be given directly observed, because obviously directly observed has its own resource implications. So again, a study done sponsored by the CDC in the US. About 1,000 individuals who were recommended to start 3-HP were randomized to DOT, self-administered with monthly visits, so pretty routine care, or self-administered but with a weekly reminder. Every week you're supposed to take your dose. You get a SMS text saying, I don't know what actually, but presumably reminding them to take their dose. The outcome was simply treatment completion, defined as 11 doses out of 12 within 16 weeks. And it was non-inferiority again, meaning self-administered was not worse than directly observed. since completion rates, as I've shown over and over again, are typically 85 to 90% with DOT. You can't do much better than that. Okay, so in terms of completion, so overall, DOT was 87% completion, and you see the confidence intervals there. Self-administered was 74%, so monthly visits, and that was actually significantly worse. So they could not conclude non-inferiority. They had to, if you will, conclude it was worse. And self-administer with the text reminders, not a whole lot better. And again, still significantly worse. You see the confidence intervals do not overlap at all. The US only sites, the self-administered groups did a little better. I'm not quite sure why. The DOT groups also did slightly worse. And so, in fact, in the US sites only, a secondary analysis, they could conclude that self-administered was non-inferior. But overall, the primary analysis, they had to conclude that self-administered was indeed worse. So this suggests that this regimen really is better given. It's once a week, it's 12 doses, should be given by DOT. Okay, so there has been recently this year publication. These are authors mainly from US CDC. They reviewed 19 studies, most of which were conducted in the US, at least partially. About 5,000 individuals received 3HP and another 5,000 other regimens. Again, the vast majority were given by DOT in terms of the treatment. Overall, 3HP, the completion was 87%, other regimens 66%. So clearly 3HP, the completion is excellent. And again, by DOT from this systematic review, 87%, self-administered 82%. So not much difference in this systematic review, although there are, as you see, really only 2 studies where self-administered therapy was given. Now, in terms of efficacy, so here, these numbers are always what's the relative risk of, let's say, TB disease with 3HP relative to groups that received 6 INH. And so in this case, for example, just to explain, so relative to 6 months of INH, 3HP was very much the same, if anything, slightly higher rates of TB disease, but lower rates of adverse events. Compared to 9 months INH, TB disease was lower, not significantly, and adverse events were also lower, again, not significantly. Relative to 3 to 4 months INH and RIF, basically identical, both in terms of TB prevention and adverse events. And for RIF, there was not enough data to make any comparison. There really haven't been any trials comparing 4-RIF with 3HP directly or head-to-head. Okay, so that summarizes 3HP, and now I'm moving on to 4 months RIF. Okay, so 4 months RIF. So first of all, this story starts back in the 1980s with a mouse model of latent TB. In this graph, the top line with the solid bars, I'm not sure if you can see my arrow, is the control group. So this is sort of the mice living with a certain bacillary load in their lungs. This line with square filled boxes is INH alone. So you can see that by 6 months, the bacillary load drops to near zero, kind of sort of correlating with human experience. And here's rifampin alone, rifampin and pyrazinamide, or all three drugs, rifampin, pyrazinamide, and INH. And you'll see that the curves are really overlapping, suggesting that, at least my conclusion from this, is that rifampin alone produces exactly the same effect in terms of this mouse model as combination therapy that includes rifampin, which should justify rifampin alone, at least in the mouse model, very nicely, and kind of the other drugs are just, you might think, even in the mice, adding toxicity. Okay, this was the, there aren't very many trials with rifampin alone. This was an older trial conducted in Hong Kong among mostly men with silicosis and a positive TST. You can see the rate in placebo, which is up here. 27% developed active TB over 5 years of follow-up. Very high rates of disease, kind of akin to HIV. With INH and rifampin for 3 months, 16% developed disease. INH alone, 14%, and rifampin alone for 3 months had the lowest rate, 10%. But the three regimens were all significantly different from placebo, but none were significantly different from each other in this study. So now a bit of personal history, if you will. So this is a series of studies that I'm going to show you that I've been led since quite a few years. So hopefully I can get this to work, because it's animated, but now. So first of all, phase 1, we did a single center study of completion, started in 2001, finished in 2003. Then we went on to adverse events and costs, finished in 2007. Then went on to efficacy and effectiveness, and had a pediatric arm with 800 plus enrolled, completed that in 2016. The adult arm was 6,000, completed in 2017, and we finally published all this in 2018, which actually are the attachments that are available. Okay, so going back to phase 1. So again, a very small study, just kind of almost proof of concept. To no one's surprise, 4 months of RIF daily self-administered was significantly better completed than 9 months of INH daily self-administered. In phase 2, again, we looked at completion. Again, 4 months rifampin better than 9 months INH, significantly better. And the key thing in phase 2 was the side effects or the toxicity. So overall, grade 3 to 4 toxicity, significantly lower with 4 months RIF, and particularly hepatotoxicity. Really, that accounted for all the difference between the two arms. With INH, 3.8%, which might seem high, but in this randomized trial, we enrolled people of all ages who had risk factors for disease, so close contacts might be older, people with abnormal x-rays, that sort of thing. So the hepatotoxicity rate is relatively high, but again, you might consider it relatively high even in the 4 RIF. Okay, so we went on to a phase 3 study. I'm really going to show only a couple of slides about design. So this was an open label, positive controlled randomized trial. Really the same design as pretty well all other randomized trials over the last 20 years in latent TB, where the duration has been different. So INH daily self-administered for 9 months, and rifampin daily self-administered for 4 months. For the kids, doses were calculated by weight and age based on recent WHO guidelines. Recent, I think it was 2010 or 2011, where they increased the doses quite substantially on a milligram per kilogram basis. And it was in 9 countries, which you can see here. So Canada, Australia, 3 countries in West Africa, Korea, Indonesia. The 2 countries that are in parentheses is because they did not participate in the pediatric study, but all listed participate in the adult study. So just a quick note, one thing we did in this study, because they're open label, we used independent outcome assessment by blinded panels to judge both active TB and adverse events. I'm not really going to dwell on this. just to say it was kind of a design feature to try to overcome potential bias due to the open label nature of the design. Okay, so first, results in kids. So as I said, these two papers are attached or available. So the pediatric randomized trial, we were mainly interested in safety and tolerability. Efficacy was a secondary outcome. The notion being that if efficacy was proven, was shown in the adult trial, most people would assume, would be happy to assume that efficacy would be the same in kids. But safety tolerability, that's a much more difficult assumption to extrapolate from adults to children. So treatment completion, again, there was a significant difference between RIF and INH. Both groups, treatment completion was high, 86%, 76%, due to the kind of the clustered nature of the data. The risk difference calculated and adjusted properly was 13%. Adverse events in children, there were no serious adverse events that were attributed by the panel to treatment. There were a couple of adverse events. There was one motor vehicle accident caused a death in a child on 4-RIF, and one teenager randomized to 9-INH got pregnant. Minor symptoms were also virtually identical. So safety, tolerability, identical in the two groups, and really both regimens were very well tolerated in children, which is kind of the experience with INH generally. Active TB, there were 2 cases of active TB, both in the INH arm. One of those 2 cases had INH resistance, although really we thought when we looked at it closely that it was unrelated because this particular individual took treatment for less than, really less than a month, less than 2 weeks in fact. Okay, so moving on quickly to adults. So now the study objective was prevention of active TB, both confirmed and clinical and confirmed, and then we also looked at completion and safety. So first of all, completion, again, completion was not as good as in kids, but still a substantial difference between 4-RIF and 9-INH, not surprisingly. Incidence of active TB was truly identical or virtually identical. And again, we had intended this to be both a superiority as the primary analysis. We could not conclude either arm was superior, and non-inferiority was a secondary analysis. We could conclude non-inferiority of 4-RIF. I think, again, looking at the numbers, you would conclude that indeed their efficacy appears very similar. And this was, we analyzed it as MITT, so intention to treat, also per protocol, no difference, confirmed and clinical. So every way we analyzed it, there was no significant difference between the 2 arms, and we could conclude non-inferiority for all these different analyses. Now, in terms of adverse events, again, in the phase 2 trial, we'd seen a significant difference. This was borne out again. Overall rates of toxicity were lower, possibly because the average age of the participants was lower in this trial. But again, what you see is the biggest difference is in hepatotoxicity. Again, 4-RIF, 3 per 1,000 rate of hepatotoxicity compared to 2% with INH. So this really drove the difference. There was a slight excess of hematologic toxicity as well in the 4-RIF arm. Of course, drug interactions, not significant, but tended to be another problem with 4-RIF. So conclusion to the study, I frankly was delighted that the question was still relevant after all those years of trying. 4-RIF had better completion in adults and children. It was safer in adults and very well tolerated in children, and non-inferior to 9-INH for TB prevention, again, in adults and children. So the last point is to try to sum up and compare all these four regimens. Dominic Zenner published this actually in 2018. He's done an update using the results from this 4RIF trial that I just showed you, but not yet published. So I'm showing you actually results that don't include this 4RIF study. But he has done a network meta-analysis with 61 studies, 16 different regimens, looking at TB incidence, efficacy, and toxicity, primarily hepatotoxicity. So what I've done here is I've taken out let's say the four regimens of interest, sorry, the five, counting 6H and 9INH as two regimens. So really of the five, and then I've used his rankings. So his rankings sometimes were not exactly 1, 2, 3, 4, 5, but it's still in the same order as his rankings. So what you see is that in terms of efficacy, first of all, the 4R seems to have better ranking. And in terms of toxicity, there's a particularly striking difference where and this is again relative to no treatment, where the INH groups have slightly higher toxicity, which is of course expected, and all of the others have lower, but the only rifampin has significantly lower hepatotoxicity compared to no treatment. And interestingly, again, 4-rifampin comes out ahead in terms of efficacy. I personally find the 3HP a bit surprising because, again, the studies that I showed you, the efficacy of 3HP was really excellent. But in any event, I think really if you look, the efficacy, the odds ratio for efficacy are all very similar and all overlap with each other for all these regimens, including 6-INH, 3 to 4 months INH RIF, 3HP, and so on. But in terms of safety, really the only one that's significantly safer than no treatment is 4R. So yeah, safety first. Okay, so again, just to repeat, these are WHO recommendations. I know I showed them at the beginning. I'm just bringing them back to remind everyone. So 6H is the first choice, 3HR, 3HP are the alternatives in high incidence countries, and 9H and 3 or 4R are added alternatives. Again, the 3R comes from the Hong Kong study, and the 4R perhaps from the more recent studies. I would suggest 4R would be a better alternative than 3, but anyway. So my personal recommendation, so first of all, I think that 4R is the safest regimen and should replace 9H. For sure, I think that everywhere we should move away from INH. It's longer, less well completed, and more toxic than the alternatives, or at best, toxicity similar with INH. The main problem with 4R is that active TB has to be reliably excluded. Again, I've not shown this data, but there is a systematic review and meta-analysis with rifampin-containing regimens. No evidence that rifampin creates resistance if TB is excluded adequately, and that's obviously the key. The other major drawback of 4R are drug interactions, and there's a lot of medications where there's drug interactions. 3HP is a good alternative. Again, I think that needs to be given by DOT based on the evidence. Excellent efficacy. There is a safety issue. So far, still no fatalities, but the systemic drug reactions do continue to be reported. And so there needs to be access to medical care and supportive therapy. These reactions are rare, but can be very severe. 3 to 4 months of HR. I think it's certainly very acceptable. It's shorter. It's not safer than 6 months INH. but it's going to be better completed. The burden is less. And the other advantage of 3 to 4-HR is that it's readily accessible in all countries in formulations for children, for adults, etc. So it's very easily, the uptake is easy. But again, I do think that we should move away from 6 months INH and 9 months INH as quickly as we can. Thank you. And I'm stop here and turn it over to Annette.
Thank you, Dick, for this very clarifying and assertive presentation. We had a very large audience of at least 200, well, computers, maybe more people, and we have many questions. So I'll start with the first question, which was about regimens that could be used for DRTB. And also together with this question is if bedaquiline can be used, has been used for the treatment of LTBI.
Okay, great questions. So for DRTB, there have been a number of case series or observational studies, non-controlled, using fluoroquinolones of varying durations, both in adults and children, often generally in close contacts of patients with multi-drug resistant TB. And a systematic review was done by, I don't know all the authors, but I know Suzanne Marks was one of the authors from CDC. And essentially the observational studies show pretty good effectiveness of a fluoroquinolone containing regimen. The question at the moment is how long. There is a randomized trial ongoing, actually in Vietnam, of household contacts of MDR patients using 6 months of levaquin but this is ongoing, and I think it'll be another couple of years before we see results. So at the moment, I would say that a fluoroquinolone appears to be efficacious. The duration is unclear, but again, the minimum given has been 6 months. And in some of the studies, ethambutol has been given with it. I don't know if it's necessary, but again, evidence is limited at the moment as to how long and whether you need to give it with an extra drug. Bedaquiline, I mean, in theory, it should work, of course, but I've seen no data. And at the moment, given the high cost of bedaquiline, even in low-income countries, compared to levaquin, which is now available as a generic, so levofloxacin, and again, given the observational data that has been reviewed and appears to be effective and, of course, safe, I would really suggest a levofloxacin as the treatment of choice for contacts of drug-resistant cases.
Thank you. There are also a lot of questions about treatment of LTBI in pregnant women, and also many questions about costs and cost effectiveness of treatment, mainly in low-income countries.
Sure. So, so let me just deal with the pregnancy first. So INH and rifampin are both considered safe in pregnancy. I'm actually not quite sure how rifampin is ranked. So to be honest, I'm not 100% sure. I'll have to look that up and send that back. I think there's a mechanism to send out answers later to all the participants. But INH and rifampin are both considered safe in pregnancy. So I think either INH or INH-RIF or rifampin alone, all would be safe in pregnancy. Again, generally speaking, the recommendations are to give treatment to latent TB in high-risk people. So this would be close contacts, people with HIV, co-infection, potentially other immune-compromising situations, because, again, these drugs are felt to be safe in pregnancy, and the risk of disease to the fetus is much greater. But in a low risk, so someone who happens to be screened, maybe a healthcare worker for some reason is screened and is pregnant, usually we defer till after pregnancy treatment. In terms of costs, cost effectiveness, again, very interesting. There's been a lot of work on cost effectiveness of INH in different settings. There's not been nearly as much work with these new regimens. I think it's important to redo these things using kind of reasonable costs for 3HP, for example, including the DOT costs, but also the drug costs. In any event, I think it's an important next step.
Thank you. Dick, there's a question about, that is very, very frequent when you give any talk about LTBI treatment, which is the risk of reinfection after the preventive therapy. What do you want to comment about that?
Right. So there are quite a lot of studies from very high incidence countries, particularly from South Africa, where and Botswana actually come to think of it. So countries where the incidence at the time of the study was 1,000 per 100,000, or like 1% of the population having active TB every year, crazy high rates of disease. And of course, the transmission at the community level was also very high in these countries. And in these studies, particularly among HIV-infected individuals, they showed that while TB rates dropped during the time of taking treatment for latent TB, rates rose again quite quickly as soon as the therapy was done. And so there have been a few studies looking at prolonged duration, so 36 months of INH, for example, in these settings, showing that rates then stay low again until you finish. The difficulty there is, there's a lot of steady drop off. People drop out of treatment, and there's a kind of steadily cumulative toxicity with this approach. But nevertheless, it is recommended that in such high incidence settings, particularly individuals who are immune compromised, to consider prolonged therapy. I don't actually know of any programs that are doing it on a systematic basis, kind of nationwide, because the implications are very difficult. In lower transmission settings, then we go back to all the studies that have been done in the past where, rates dropped following treatment and stayed low during follow-up, and were lower in those who were treated than placebo group for 5 years, such as the Eastern European trial, or as long as 19 years in some studies. So when transmission rates are low, such as low incidence countries, below 100 per 100,000 for sure, then it seems like benefits are prolonged, and one single course of therapy is adequate.
Okay, we have two questions about other regimens. One is about the ultra short regimen. If you know the follow-up duration, and if this might affect the interpretation of the findings. And the other one is about your opinion on the 36 months of Isoniazid.
Right. So, the ultra short, I don't know all the details of the study. As I said, it was presented in abstract form only. I didn't actually personally attend the meeting, so I just got some of this information through correspondence. So I don't know. I mean, I think that 1 HP, the study is very promising. I think there are some concerns. It appears that the completion rates in both arms was very high. So obviously it's a randomized trial kind of setting, which may or may not correspond to the reality. The adverse event with daily rifampin, you want to look at that very closely, because obviously something with a long half-life like rifampin, you would expect there might be more toxicity towards the end of the study. So how closely people were followed at the end of therapy and even in a couple of weeks after would be very important to look at. So again, I think we have to wait for the full publication to get the full details. And as always, a study in non-HIV infected individuals will be very important before trying to extrapolate this. I think everyone remembers the 2-month rifampin pyrazinamide story, where this regimen was well tolerated and appeared to be safe in HIV infected individuals. But when rolled out in non-HIV infected individuals, suddenly everyone realized that it was actually very hepatotoxic. So I think it's got to be tested in the populations where it will be used. So even if it appears effective and safe in HIV infected individuals, you need at least safety studies in non-HIV infected individuals and children and so on before considering it for these other groups. I would really stress that. So 36 months of INH, yes. So this is this whole issue of how long does protection last after you stop therapy. So in very high incidence settings where, again, in the studies that were done that showed that there was kind of reinfection soon after stopping treatment for latent TB, incidence in those countries was around 1,000 per 100,000 in those years. So 1% incidence of active TB. So very high rates of disease. In those settings, there was benefit from prolonged therapy. 36 months of INH was beneficial compared to 6 months of INH, followed by placebo. The issue really revolves around toxicity because, again, in the studies where this was given in a prolonged fashion, there was more toxicity and programmatic aspects because, of course, people have to be followed closely the whole time and encouraged because otherwise you see steady dropouts over time. So it's there are some advantages. The advantages are mostly have been demonstrated in HIV infected populations, so immune suppressed, and in very high incidence settings. I think in most settings where you're looking at incidence of 200 to 300 per 100,000, there have not been studies, but there have been older studies where, placebo controlled, and clearly there was benefit, and the benefit lasted for 2 years or 5 years, depending on the follow-up, suggesting that this problem of reinfection was much less of a problem in these countries where HIV prevalence was lower, or it was older studies, so it was non-existent, and overall incidence rates and therefore transmission rates were much lower than were seen in these few studies of prolonged INH. So bottom line, prolonged INH to be considered when you have very high incidence of disease in the range of over 750 per 100,000. I don't think it's that relevant with incidence below 300 per 100,000, because then I think you can rely on data from older studies where the effect of one round of LTBI therapy was prolonged for many years after end of therapy.
Thank you, Dick. We still have over 170 attendees on. Can you hold for 2 or 3 minutes more?
I can hold. I don't know whether the webinar is going to implode or something.
They are okay. I would like to ask you, Dick, why WHO ended up recommending for RIF only for low incidence countries? Does it have anything to do with fear of resistance? And you talked a little bit about emergency of resistance in your presentation, but I would like, because this is a very frequent question, and it's we hear that from NTPs and from clinicians, and I think it's a very important point. Thank you.
So thanks, Annette. So first of all, to be clear, I absolutely don't speak for WHO, and that's why I put that slide up. What did WHO say? That's what WHO says or recommends, and what do I think is my personal opinion.
Okay.
So to be clear, I'm not representing WHO. I wasn't actually on the 2018 committee, only on an earlier one. So I don't know why 4-RIF was not recommended, but I think from speaking to people that the concern is if you give 4-RIF, so mono-rifampin, to individuals in whom active TB has not been excluded adequately, then you end up with mono-rifampin resistance potentially. Now note that 3-HP, most people would consider that mono-rifampin therapy for most of the week. So people get high dose INH, 900 milligrams, 1 day a week. And that, you know, by all accounts should have disappeared after 3 days. And the rifampin, potentially the effect lasts for most of the week. So essentially 3-HP is also mono-rifampin therapy, but that's an inconsistency that I leave to others to argue over. In any event, in two meta-analyses, one with INH and the other for rifampin, there is no evidence that in people, in studies where active TB was adequately excluded through x-rays, through microbiologic testing, etc., that monotherapy with INH produces INH resistance or monotherapy with RIF produces RIF resistance. The problem is always excluding active TB adequately. It's easy to say, and in practice, not always easy to do in settings where x-rays may be inaccessible or unreliable or hard to read, etc. So I think that's why 4-RIF has not been recommended. Again, I think if you're in a setting where you can confidently exclude active TB, 4-RIF is a very good option.
Okay. There's a question about the background risk, because treatment depends on the background risk. So the question is, are all these studies rigorously tested in high incidence countries? I think you have much to tell about that.
Right, so most of the studies nowadays are done in high incidence countries. The 4-RIF trial that I showed you, again, the sites, there were 3 sites in West Africa, Guinea, Benin, and Ghana. There were also Indonesia and Brazil. So, you know, ranging from high to intermediate incidence settings. And again, in Brazil, Brazil is, I mean, Annette's online here as the moderator, but Brazil is a country with very heterogeneous TB incidence. So there are parts of Brazil where the incidence is very high and other parts where it's low. And again, in Brazil, the study was conducted in clinics situated in parts of Brazil with high incidence. So I would say that by and large, again, all of the studies, many of the studies were done in sub-Saharan Africa for 3-HP, for 3-HR, etc. So yes, I would say most of the studies are done in intermediate to high incidence countries now, or most of the study populations, even if the studies involve Canada, the US, and so on. So I think the findings are relevant to those settings.
And one final question is about rifabutin, if it's the same as rifampin, and it has to do also with another question about ascertaining that there is no drug-to-drug interaction when you give a regimen.
Okay, good. So that's a very important question as well. Rifabutin is like rifampin and rifamycin in terms of its anti-TB activity. But unlike rifampin and rifampin, has much less drug interactions. So while rifampin may lower some drugs by, I don't know, 80%, rifabutin usually less than 10 or 20%. So rifabutin is often used for active TB in people where there are very important drug interactions. Unfortunately, there's very little data of use of rifabutin as treatment of latent TB infection, so it is difficult to extrapolate or recommend with any confidence. We know that in active TB, rifampin in the right doses, and sometimes that's tricky as well, can adequately replace rifampin. So it should be possible to replace rifampin. Now, rifampin is something that has to be given daily as well. So you can't really replace rifampicin with rifampin, at least not once weekly. But I think you could on an individual basis, knowing, however, that there's very limited data to support it, but on a case-by-case basis, you might consider rifampicin to replace rifampin when drug interactions were really too important to manage. For HIV, there are regimens that can be given that do not have significant interactions, or they're manageable. So again, locally, with help from our pharmacists, we do put patients on antiretrovirals on rifampin.
Thank you so much, Dick, for this presentation and this debate. Thank you for the audience for keeping with us. I would like now to ask the audience to stay for one more minute while I hand back to the organizers. Jill will talk you about the survey we're going to do. Thank you very much. Thank you, Dick.
Thank you very much.
Thank you, and thank you all for listening in.
Thank you very much, Dr. Menzies, and to Dr. Treiman for the presentation and the informative Q&A session. As Annette mentioned, once you leave today's webinar, you will receive a survey on the presentation. It's just a few really quick questions, so we would be grateful if you could keep your browser window open and complete that and provide your feedback for us. You will also receive a follow-up email within 24 to 48 hours, which will include a link to a recording of today's webinar. On behalf of the Union and our presenters, thank you so much for joining us, and please do enjoy the rest of your day. Goodbye.